Hi, this is Terry White for Havel Scissors. Today I'm going to show you how to make a fan scissor pouch. Here is the project. There is a button closure. This is a piece of elastic, and so use a button with 2 holes in it and a shank button to hold it closed. Now I'm going to open it up so you can see the fan. Okay, now I made this for Jeannie Delpit because she wanted a place for her snips and a place for her 7-inch serrated scissors and a place for her 5.5-inch curved scissors. And so I've made little identification windows, and you can see there's decorative stitching, and I put bangles on the end for added beauty. Now this is the main pattern piece for the decorative panel, and I'm calling the outside of the scissor pouch the decorative panel. So it is also divided by these lines. You see this? And you can see here that these are the pattern pieces for the fabrics, okay? So I'm going to, this was cut out of tracing paper, and then I drew my lines on the paper. Okay, so this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to use this tracing paper as my pattern as I cut out the fabrics. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to lay the fabric down, and here is my pattern piece. You can see that I accidentally cut it at one point. Okay, so I'm going to use this. Here is my rotary cutter. I'm going to lay the ruler on the outside of that pattern piece and cut it with my rotary cutter. You see how I'm doing this. And then for this last side right here, I'm going to fold the paper back. And so now you can see I've got my first pattern piece. And you just keep doing that. You fold, cut the next one, fold it back like this to cut that side. That way your main pattern piece stays all together, and you also can see the sequence in which you're going to lay each pattern piece on your project. Now the next thing I'm going to use this whole pattern piece for is to cut a piece of fusible interfacing. Now this is not fusible web, this is fusible interfacing. So it fuses on one side. Usually it's a gluey side, it's a rough texture. And this is an interfacing, so it doesn't fuse the fabric to something else, it just stabilizes the fabric. Now, the next thing I'm going to do is, as I cut the pattern pieces out of my fabric, I'm going to lay them on that piece of fusible interfacing and move them up against each other so that they're just right next to each other, okay? And then I'm going to take an iron to that, and I'm going to fuse it down so that the pieces are now attached to the interfacing, which will stabilize it when I do decorative stitching. Now when I press the fabric to the fusible interfacing, this is how I do it. like this. You don't want to iron back and forth. You want to press it so it doesn't wiggle around. Okay, and you can also see that when I cut my fusible interfacing, I left some extra all around the edges, and that's just because it's easier to put these pieces on a bigger piece of interfacing than to try to just, you know, match it up exactly. It gets a little bit, it gets a little futzy. Okay, now I'm also going to use the same pattern piece for the lining. Okay, this is the lining now. And I'm also going to use the same pattern piece and cut a piece of fusible web. Now this is different than the fusible interfacing. This is the stuff that you iron onto fabric, pull the paper off, and then you can iron that fabric to another piece of fabric. So this is a piece of fusible web. This is the pattern for the scissor pocket. And I'm going to use this pattern. You can see that I've drawn some lines here, and there's simply a line from this point to the very point here. Okay, so this is the same fabric that I'm using for the lining that I'm using for the pocket, and it's cotton, and you can see that I've drawn this line. Okay, now the next thing that I do is I'm going to fold the top of the scissor pocket back. These three seams, these three edges are going to be folded back about 1/2 inch. And I used seam tape, which is a fusible web on little pieces of paper, and you iron it to the fabric, and then you pull the paper off, and then you fold it down, and that just keeps it in place until I do my decorative stitching. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do, and I want to remind you, all of the pattern pieces and full instructions will be on havelsewing.com website. So after I've folded this back, then I've got some extra fabric, and I'm going to iron fusible web onto the fabric. Now, you can see then what I do is I pull the fusible web, the paper back off. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to press this. Now this is on the back of the scissor pocket. Now what this is going to do when I press this is it is going to add some structure and stabilization to the scissor pocket. So I'll have one here and I'll have one here, and they'll be ironed on. And then the next step is to take it to the sewing machine. Now I am stitching decorative stitches along the seams on the decorative panel. What I want you to see is the foot has a line right there. That is center needle position. And the stitch that I chose has the same amount of stitching on either side of the center needle position. This way my guide is that line, and I can go right along the line of this seam. Now, you can see that I'm using subtle colors. I'm not making the decorative stitches really dark so that you know, for your benefit, you can see these stitches. And I like to use threads that are similar in depth and color of the fabrics that I'm using, because I think it adds richness with some decoration. This is a small project, so you're not going to see these stitches from far away, but you're not looking at this project from far away either. This is the scissor pocket piece, and I folded down the top of the scissor pocket, and then I did this pretty decorative stitch with this multicolor coral thread. Now, I have pressed this extra stabilizer piece right here for reinforcement, and it has the same amount of fabric on either side of this center line. You can see that I used a pink pen to draw that line so that it's pretty. Now I'm going to do a stitch on either side of the center line for decoration. That is not what I meant to do. I want to show you something that we usually edit out, and that is when I make a mistake, we usually turn the camera off, and because I've positioned my stitch in the wrong spot. But I want to show you these little snips and how great they are for getting these tiny, cutting out these tiny little stitches. Aren't they great? These are little Havel snips. And I'm able to take out these little teeny stitches. I like them because they have this curve, and I'm less likely to cut into my fabric. Isn't that great? These are wonderful. Plus, they're very easy on your hands because you just smush them like that. All right. Now, there we go. I didn't have my foot positioned correctly for this stitch, and I also wanted to make the stitch go the opposite direction. So this is better. Now I've laid my scissor pocket on my lining, and I'm going to stitch down that center line now, stitching the pocket to the lining. And the stitch that I'm using is, oh, some people call it a lightning stitch. It's a utility stitch, and it is a slanted zigzag. And that's what I'm using to stitch the pocket to the lining. So here what you see is the scissor pocket stitched to the lining. Okay. I'm going to move this back. Now I'm going to turn this over. This is your decorative panel. Now at one point you will trim your decorative panel to take all of the interfacing off and any rough points. Okay? Then what you're going to do is you're going to make sure that the lining is the same shape, so you can put that next to it and trim that up. And then, so I'm going to take my decorative panel and turn it over. You're going to trim your fusible web a little bit smaller than your decorative panel. Iron it on and pull the paper back. And then we're going to put the scissor pocket with the lining on the decorative panel. See, it lines right up. And then fuse it so that the lining is now fused to the decorative panel. Okay. I'm going to move it, press. All right, so now I'm going to show you kind of the magic part. You see, this is the pocket, right? That's where the pocket is. Here are the pockets, right? Okay. So this side will fold over. And when you first do it, you'll sort of, when you first fold it over, you'll sort of hand press, okay, where that stitching is. And then going to fold it over again. Now see, it's not the decorative stitching is now going across. You see, it's not all coming up like this, it's going all across. And then this is the part that will fold down. Okay, now the last step is to stitch. Open it out and stitch everything together all around the edge. And I'll give you some instruction on havelsewing.com for that. And the next thing, see, this is the one side of it. Once again, I'm going to show you, turn it over. Here is the flap. Okay, now I'm going to show you where I'm going to put my decorative buttons. Now this is the button that I'm going to use for the closure. It's a vintage button. This is elastic. Starts out white. Once you color it, it's colored. So this will be going right up here. And then this is the button that is the shank button. And this will attach to this button. Okay, so I'll be stitching that. And then I'm going to be adding, on this one, I'm going to be adding this little piece of jewelry that I found. Isn't that fun? And I'll be adding some more baubles and some beads, which you'll see in the full instructions on havelsewing.com. I hope you enjoyed this project. You will find the pattern and instructions at havelsewing.com. This is Terry White for Havel Scissors.